in Ontario, they're reopening the movie theaters, and there's not really much in the way of new releases. Most companies have either moved them till next year or later this year, or they're just kind of waiting to see what's going to happen with COVID. So they don't have anything new to show. So they brought back a lot of the old stuff like Bloodshot, I think it's called, Sonic the Hedgehog, The Hunt, stuff that was playing prior to the lockdown. But they've also brought out their catalog of classic movies. So they've had stuff like Jurassic Park, which is one of my personal favorites. And they started to bring out the Star Wars movies, as well as the Christopher Nolan movies. And I was looking around because I wanted to go see a movie now that it's open again, just for popcorn, and because it's just a good kind of escape. It's an hour or two. It's a couple hours where you can't use your cell phone, where no one's going to bother you, and you're just kind of immersed in something. I do love to go see movies in theaters. So I was looking at the schedule, and I'm like, oh, they have Empire Strikes Back and like their super HD ultimate format. And I'm like, how much are they charging? And they have a special rate for a lot of their classics of $5. I'm like, so I can go see Empire Strikes Back in like IMAX for $5. And I'm like, I'm gonna go see that, because I was thinking to myself, maybe I've gone too far in criticizing the reboots. Because, I mean, I've said they're like the worst stuff I've ever seen. I said that Rise of Skywalker may be the worst movie I've ever seen that had a budget. I've just shit on them constantly. And maybe the originals weren't the masterpieces I remember. Maybe it's not maybe it's not like ruining their legacy. Maybe it's a renewal the franchise needed. So I went to see The Empire Strikes Back, and it's been, I guess, exactly 40 years now. It came out in 1980, if memory serves properly. And it's been 40 years. Does it hold up? You bet your ass it does. I gotta say, this movie was actually a lot better than I remember it being. And I know I could watch this movie at any time on, like, Blu-ray or something, but I think there's something for things like sci-fi or fantasy movies where seeing it in theater on the big screen with the surround sound, it just kind of, some movies just need to be seen that way, I think, to get the full enjoyment out of them. And this film was a lot better than I remember it being. And that might just be because I haven't seen it in like 15 years or longer, like just sat down and watched the whole film. It might be I just know a lot more about cinema and I have a lot more appreciation for different things than I used to. It might be just because I'm a lot more into Star Wars than I used to be, and all the extended universe and that kind of stuff. But honestly, this film was a lot better than I remember it being. And not just like in comparison to the new movies, but it's a damn good movie. There's a lot of things to just really like about it. And hopefully maybe they'll re-release Return of the Jedi so I can watch that again in theaters and I can see how that works out. But maybe just kind of to give my hot, raw take, having just seen it a little while before I record this, as to why I thought this movie was so good, having seen it a second time. Firstly, I gotta say, I think The Empire Strikes Back has some of the best pacing of like any movie ever made. It does a very good job of balancing rapid action with slower scenes. And it's very good at cutting between different things. Like you'll have, on the Battle of Hoth, you'll have them cut to the speeders attacking the AT-ATs, then you'll cut back to like Leia and Han flirting. Then you'll cut to like Luke getting shot down. Then you'll cut back to like the control room. Then you'll cut to the transports escaping. It doesn't stay on anything too long to kind of get boring, and it really does give the sense of a chase, that the whole movie, the rebels are running, the Empire is striking back, for lack of a better term, and it's just a constant chase, but it's done in such a way that it really doesn't feel like a lot of films that have a lot of rapid cuts. I can't follow them. It's just like there's shaky cam. There's not a logical order of events. it's just very tough for me to even know like what the hell's going on. And I didn't find that at all in this movie. It was just very easy to tell what was happening. And even when you get into stuff like Luke on Dagobah, because they cut back and forth and they cut back to like nothing basically happening there, or just very slow, him training with Yoda, back to Leia and Han and kind of where the action's happening, you really get this, you really kind of conveys this sense that Luke is like completely isolated from like the wider war and the wider conflict. And he's kind of almost in this little pocket dimension. And you really do get this sense of he's just completely out of the way. And that he's kind of, I don't know if goofing around's the right term, but he's really just kind of not taking part in all this stuff. And he wants to kind of get back in action. He wants to get back to that stuff. And the training scenes really don't go on very long. I think whoever made it kind of realized that that's a part of the movie because it's kind of slower, that if you overdo it and you show too much of it at any one time, it's going to get kind of boring. But it doesn't. It only lasts for a couple of minutes and then it cuts back. And once again, that's a good way of showing the passage of time there and that Luke's making progress. So being able to pace a movie properly is something that's very, very hard to do. And this film does a really good job of it. Probably, arguably the best I've seen in like any film in terms of being able to pace it properly. It never feels rushed. It never feels like it's going nowhere. It does a very good job balancing the tension, the fast scenes, the slow scenes. Secondly, I think one of the things that I immediately noticed, and this is something I kind of like in, I guess, 1970s, 1980s sci-fi stuff like an Alien, where not everything in the future, or a Blade Runner, not everything in the future is super, like, sleek and seamless, and there's no obvious wires. I kind of like, especially in the older Star Wars movies, how there's just kind of wires everywhere, like you're on the Millennium Falcon, and, like, there's just stuff hanging out of the ceiling. And even in Bespin, you have like the kind of the contrast between the very new, clean, white inside of like living area. And then you have like this mass of wires and power converters and stuff down below. And it looks a lot more, I guess, kind of, I don't know if realistic's the right term, but I just kind of like the gritty, somewhat cobbled together, it doesn't look like it entirely works thing. And that's something I really liked about Evangelion, is you really got the impression that it was this like ragtag operation, that this was all of humanity's resources was going into this, and they just didn't really like, they were trying to do something above and beyond what they had the capacity for. I think it also contrasts really nice with the Imperial ships, because they're much more like sleek and you don't see a lot of that stuff. They're much more standardized comparison to how a lot of the Rebel stuff was. So just kind of getting along with that theme of realism, the action scenes in this I find are a lot better in some ways than the newer ones. The newer ones were a lot more over the top and epic, and there's something to be said for that. But this feels a lot more realistic, and there's going to be some asshole who's like, oh, but they're using blasters and lightsabers. Yeah, but like when I'm watching the Battle of Hoth, and this might just be because of the era when it was filmed, it feels like I'm watching like The Longest Day or some sort of like older war movie. It doesn't feel like I'm watching some like... I mean, I'm not sure really how to describe it, but just the way people move, kind of the deliberate pace of combat, how people are using cover, that sort of thing. It feels very much like a World War II battle. And even when you get into like the hall fighting and that sort of thing, you don't really have that much crazy stuff doing. You have people just taking pot shots from behind walls. You have a much kind of slower, more methodical, but in a way still very tense style of combat. And I really kind of appreciate that. You really get the impression more in this sort of thing that it's Star Wars. Like it's an actual war. It just, everybody acts a lot more professionally. Like the Empire and the Imperials in this act very professionally. They make like logical decisions. They get outsmarted, but they make logical decisions. They seem like they're a real threat. They don't seem completely retarded. And I mean, there's jokes in this and there's funny stuff that happens in this, but like contrast like Pian and there's some of the other Imperial officers to like the guy that like General Hux who's like retarded, and the guy who the Yomama jokes, and just like General Pride, and just like all the lame First Order officers. None of them seem like a threat. They're all like threat. They're just all like completely retarded. And in kind of contrast to that, you have much more kind of interesting bad guys. Like, and then the rebels also act more like a formal military. They wear like, their uniforms look a lot more real, if that makes sense. Like they look like kind of like if actual space uniforms would look like, I guess. I don't know if I'm making sense, because I get that this is all speculative, but it does feel a lot more like this is what an actual war in space would be more like than like the kind of the cartoony shit you have in the sequels. And I get the prequels also had a lot of that cartoony stuff, and I think in those cases the prequels went more in a bit of a fantasy direction and less of a sci-fi direction. The prequels though are kind of their own thing, and they were trying to do something different. It wasn't really, they were trying to do something like different tonally and aesthetically. I think of the prequels, The Phantom Menace is a lot like the originals in terms of how it's shot and that kind of thing. But I do really like that. I think that's really well done. The writing in this, I think, is probably the best, other than maybe, like, Revenge of the Sith has a lot of really good, memorable lines, but I guess you can have mixed feelings about the writing as a whole. In Empire Strikes Back, the writing's really good, at least as far as a Star Wars movie goes. The Han-Leia flirting scenes, there's a lot more of it than I remembered, and they were a lot funnier than I remembered it. Harrison Ford really, like, you gotta give it to him. He does a great, great job as Han. Like, just being smarmy, flirting with Leia, getting Leia, like, all flustered. Just, like, his badassery in the face of death. But also, like, at his core, they do really good job with the thief with the heart of gold. Like, Han kind of stops being as cynical and kind of becomes a much better person over the course of the three movies. Like at the beginning of Empire Strikes Back, he very selflessly goes and risks his life for Luke because Luke's his friend. And you don't know if you'd really see the Han Solo at the beginning of A New Hope do something like that. But yeah, I just find the interactions, and I know Red Letter Media has said a bunch of this, but they do seem pretty genuine. They seem a lot more genuine and realistic. And once again, you can say that the prequels don't have that, and I like the prequels, but the prequels I think are just are very stylistically different, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a lot more campy than the OG Star Wars is, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. The bad thing is the sequels don't really do either. I don't really know what they do. They're just an abomination. So that's really good. The writing's good. The characters are really good. The action scenes, as I said, feel a lot more realistic and a lot more kind of tense. Because in a lot of cases, like the fantastical scientific, like futuristic technology operates pretty similar to real world technology. And once again, that's because this is very aesthetically based off of World War II in terms of like the fighter combat, the carrier ships, the Empire, like all the gun designs look very similar to like World War II or World War I era firearms, that kind of thing. And honestly, I know it's probably because it's the special edition, but the special effects look pretty damn good. Even to this day. I think it's because there's a lot of practical, and it's good practical. There's a couple scenes where it looks a little kind of dodgy. Some of the AT-AT scenes, it looks a little, I don't know if dated's the right word, but it reminds me of something like Play-Doh from like Beetlejuice or something like that, like claymation. But overall, I mean, I think the special effects look a lot better than a lot of movies today. I do, like, as I've said, I really like when they're on Dagobah, just how dirty it is. You've got real animals. They aren't like fantastical animals. It's pretty obvious that they had like ball pythons and monitor lizards and like green iguanas just crawling all over the place. And that was pretty cool. And just, it was nice to see kind of all the practical sets instead of it in front of a green screen. I don't hate CG, but I think they could be using more practical. Jurassic Park, from my understanding, was a mixture of both, and I think Jurassic Park looks really good, and it looks really good to this day. So to conclude, maybe just talk a bit about how it's changed in terms of its politics. A lot of people in kind of right-wing circles tend to view Star Wars as being, even the original trilogy, as being very left-wing, being very liberal, that the rebels are fighting for liberal democracy and the Empire's like evil, conservative fascism, that kind of thing. And they kind of view it as a right-left thing. I never really got the impression, ultimately more so than any particular political ideology. Star Wars isn't really about political ideologies. They aren't really that mentioned that often. You have a lot of politics in them, but most of the actual politics revolves around local self-interest or gaining positions of money and power. It's not so much about political ideology. Ultimately, Star Wars is about good versus evil. It's about that there is objective good and there's objective evil in the universe, and there is a universal order, be it whatever you want to call it, Dharma, Asha, Logos, that guides the universe and that we should act in accordance with. And then there is a Druge or a anti-Logos or whatever you want to call it that acts against it. There's the forces of order and the forces of disorder, and these are two separate things in that people have to choose between them. And I think if we're talking about like political interpretations, anytime where you have objective good and objective evil, I think that's inherently kind of anti-liberal narrative. It's saying it's not just culture, it's not just, there are these transcendent moral truths. Also, a lot of it is just very much based on archetypes. So it's something that's would be recognizable to Americans or whoever. You have the old republic, and then you have the empire, and you have kind of the fascist, and then the kind of more American attire. But if you really drill down into what the two sides are fighting for, I think it's very important to keep in mind the old republic wasn't a liberal democracy. It wasn't modern America. It wasn't even the modern EU. The old republic survived, I think it was 10,000 plus years, and it was an extremely loose federation of monarchies, republics, corporations, hive worlds, theocracies, all of which were pretty much entirely self-governing. I suppose, so long as they didn't really invade other systems, they kept within international trade laws, they paid their taxes, that kind of thing. The republic really didn't left them alone. You didn't really have forced immigration from some planets to others. There were many homogenous, even xenophobic planets that didn't allow immigration. There wasn't a preference that I could determine for democracy, liberal democracy as being the de facto form of government. You had monarchies, which were kind of mixed governments like Alderaan. You had elective monarchies like Naboo. You had, I think, autocracies. I think Geonosis was in that fashion. But then you also had theocratic states. You had republican states. You had the Wookiee planet, Kashyyyk, was a federal monarchy. So there was, I believe the Wookiee king was elected by the chieftains of the various Wookiee tribes from across the planet. And that's not a liberal democracy. And you have, like I said, patriarchal societies, you have more liberal societies. They're fighting basically to restore a system under which all the different cultures and peoples can have their autonomy and can have their self independence. They can have do their own thing. And that was, I think, ultimately what the Republic stood for, was all the planets and all the peoples of the galaxy to give up a relatively minor amount of freedom for collective security to safeguard their mutual independence. And it was to provide kind of an area for them to meet. And like senators weren't exclusively selected through election. Like in Alderaan, the Alderaan sector, my understanding is the heir to the throne was the senator. So sometimes it would be hereditary, sometimes it would be appointed, sometimes it would be elected. And more so than being a democracy, I think you can say the old republic was representation. The idea was that all the different peoples of the universe would have a forum where they could make their demands known and they could have their demands redressed. And that's something you have in any society. Like even if you go back to ancient Mesopotamia, you have assemblies of elders or assemblies of leading men who the king would go and consult. And that's not like an Enlightenment thing. That's something that far predates it. And that's not necessarily, like I said, liberal at all. Whereas you have the empire, which is a lot more like something, I think people tend to overemphasize the similarities between specific variants of fascism and the empire, which is more kind of a generic variant of fascism. Because specific variants of fascism tend to be a lot more identitarian. So like Spanish fascism or Falangism is much more involved in Catholicism and stuff like that. Then you have, for instance, like legionary fascism or what the Iron Guard in Romania was extremely religious because the Romanians are an extremely religious people. And then you had like German fascism, which was more secular. And then you have like Arab fascism, like Baathism, which is much, much more secular and is more based upon kind of an ethno-cultural union of the Arab peoples. But the empire is fascism on a galactic scale, so it doesn't grow out of any particular host culture. It's just kind of the generic idea. And it kind of takes the progressive aspects of fascism or the revolutionary aspects, but not the reactionary aspects. So, like, if you look at it, the empire's aesthetic is very minimalistic. It's very grand in scale, but it doesn't really have any of kind of the classical throwbacks that you get within specific fascist countries. But you have that. You also have the revolutionary aspect, the desire to destroy what's old in favor of what's new, which is something a lot of states had. A lot of fascist songs will criticize reactionaries and say it's time for a revolution. There is a very strong progressive aspect to fascism as an idea. That's why it's called reactionary modernism. And the empire very much has that. They banned a lot of traditional cultures, a lot of traditional religions. They tried to basically kind of create this generic imperial culture, which was, I guess, kind of loosely based upon so-called human high culture, and impose it upon the galaxy. And kind of one of the core aspects of fascism is that the state is the most important thing. And it was, I think, a great deal of what the empire was trying to do was de-emphasize all the local identities, de-emphasize all the different forms of government in favor of worship of the emperor as the embodiment of the imperial state, and that was going to become the totalitarian whole of the galaxy. So my point being, I think you just have to view it as kind of a good versus evil thing, even if that seems very childishly simplistic. It's kind of nice to have something childishly simplistic. The rebels, at least if you look at it in kind of the grand view, aren't fighting to make like the galaxy like 21st century Los Angeles or 21st century San Francisco. They're fighting so that the various planets can have self-determination. Like once the new republic is founded, membership is voluntary, and they don't really, other than taxes and supporting the central government, there isn't any particular thing they force on them. I think they ban slavery, which is a point in their favor, but by and large they let the individual worlds just kind of do whatever they want. And I think in terms of having a galactic government, that's a pretty good thing to fight for. And I think you can be like a reactionary, or you can be a conservative, or you can be a right-winger and sympathize with the rebels and sympathize with the Jedi and sympathize with the Old Republic. And if anything, I think that's kind of the more traditional view to take. There's a lot of things to be admired about the Empire. Its efficiency, its ability to, well, get things done. Its ability to get things done, to cut through the red tape, that sort of thing. Ability to do kind of super projects and to kind of, I guess, kind of put the greater good first. But I think it also very fairly shows kind of the drawbacks of a totalitarian state, the destruction of individual initiative, that kind of thing. So I think ultimately the old movies are just really damn good. They're good movies. I think they have a good message. I think they aren't, like, compared to the reboot and like all the politics they shove into that, they're relatively non-political. They're about, like I said, good versus evil, freedom versus tyranny, forgiveness versus revenge. They're not so much about any kind of liberal, conservative, traditional, progressive dichotomy. So I hope you enjoyed the review. God bless.